Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Pax Americana, it's an empire unprecedented in world history, possessing the global unit of exchange, the dollar, and a military unmatched by all rivals combined. The U.S. stands alone. The question is empire good for America and the world? To CrossTalk America's Imperial Ambitions, I'm joined by my guest, Bruce Fein in Washington. He is a columnist for the Washington Times, as well as author of the book American Empire Before the Fall. In New York, we have Eric Draitser. He is a geopolitical analyst and founder of the website stopimperialism.com. And in London, we cross to Vasilis Fouskas. He is the director of the Center for the Study of States, Markets, and People at the University of East London. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Eric, you're often on this program, so I'm going to ask a very straightforward and direct question. What is the condition, the health of the empire? And you know which one I'm talking about.
Well, it would be nice to be able to say that the empire is in its death throes and that somehow we're going to move towards a multipolar and a peaceful future. But of course, I think we all know that the reality is far from that, that empires, be they the current empire of which we're speaking, be they historical, they do not simply go away over the course of one night or over the course of one generation. These are things that take multiple generations. Oftentimes, they can take centuries. We can look historically at the decline of the Roman Empire, for an example. We can look at the decline of the British Empire to see that this is true. And so in answer to the question of what is the health of the empire is still very much vibrant. It is still very much powerful, and we can see that demonstrated in myriad ways. I think that many are often very keen to talk about the demise of the dollar, the demise of U.S. purchasing power, the demise of all forms of U.S. power. But the reality is these things are fundamental to the way in which the global economy works. Yep. They're fundamental to the way in which the globe works as we know it. And so to somehow say that, well, the prognosis is grim, I think is an oversimplification. What we are seeing, though, is a decentralization of that power. We're seeing it spread over multiple power centers around the world. And the current conflicts, be they Syria, Ukraine, or what have you, are all manifestations of that process.
Okay. Bruce, the same question. How do you see empire? Because I know some of your writings, and your attitude is that empire is not good for America, let alone the world.
No, it crushes the ideals of liberty and transparency that made the nation unique in 1776 when it was born. With empire, we have virtual concentration of limitless power in the presidency. For instance, the president has on 4 occasions killed American citizens based upon his unilateral determination. They were threats. There was no due process. The president claims a right of secrecy. He runs secret surveillance programs of the type that were disclosed by Edward Snowden. He detains people without accusation or charge at Guantanamo Bay or otherwise. He runs unilateral presidential wars without authorization from Congress. It's very unhealthy for the democracy. We're running, I say, a program that looks more and more like a monarchy rather than the liberty that's celebrated by the founding fathers. And it's unhealthy for the country. Number one, despite the fact that we're very skilled at killing, killing by itself is not going to win wars. We dropped more bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail trying to kill Vietnamese during the Vietnamese War, and it was totally futile on that respect. And we all recognize, even the military people, that dropping bombs on ISIS is not going to accomplish anything without ground troops. And I think even though we fought wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we weren't destroyed as an empire, we spent $6 trillion, lost thousands of men and women's lives, injuries, and what did we get? Failed states that clearly cannot be said to be victories.
Okay,
lastly, I think the debt now we have.
Okay, go ahead. Lastly, go ahead.
We have an $18 trillion national debt, and we are bankrupting ourselves. I do think it's not always the case that empires take a very protracted period to collapse. Just think, in World War I, when it concluded, you have 3 or 4 empires collapsed overnight. The Chinese, Austrian, Hungarian, the Russian Empire all disappeared, the Ottoman Empire. My view is that within 20 or 30 years, unless our pendulum swings back towards a republic, we will crumble internally whether or not there's an external force to replace us.
Vasilis, in London, if I can go to you, because this is what a lot of people would say, is that there are internal contradictions here, because the Soviet Union collapsed very quickly, too, because of internal contradictions to its economy and other issues here. Go ahead, in London.
Yeah, Peter, yes, I heard with great interest what my colleague said in Washington and New York. First of all, my first comment is that the American empire project is completely different from the previous empire projects. The way I read, for example, the history, imperial history before the Second World War, we can see there different imperial blocs fighting each other for influence over the rest of the globe. For example, we had the French Empire, we had the British Empire, then even the Italians had tried to have an empire. And this model, this imperial global model, was bound to contract. Now, after the Second World War, we have the new U.S. empire project, which basically says it's what I call hub and spoke system of imperial governance. It means that the center of power is or should be always the Washington, D.C., and this is the hub of the empire, and the rest of the world, or of the capitalist world, so to speak, at the time we had already the beginning of the Cold War, are the dependent spokes of the hub. You know, Paris is dependent on Washington and so on and so forth. The formation of NATO basically institutionalizes the dependency of the European project.
I think we could call that, I think what most people would call it, the Washington consensus here. Eric, if I can go back to you in New York, one of the things I find fascinating about this empire, empire here, is that, you know, its reliance on the use of force is quite amazing, and it's accelerating its use of force, particularly in the Middle East. But it continues to legitimize itself through Western values of participatory democracy, a participatory economy in capitalism. I find it to be a very interesting contradictory binary when you look at the rhetoric of empire.
Well, that's absolutely right. And part of the reason is because it legitimizes itself through what I would call a collective mythology, or a collective consciousness that is embedded here in the United States. And it's embedded and indoctrinated into children from a very young age, all through school and even through higher education as well. Some of these overly idealized principles and catchwords such as democracy and freedom and all of the rest of these things, which are injected into the narrative of any war, of any conflict that the United States seeks to dominate. This is a fundamental part of how the United States not only sells its imperialism to its own citizens, but the image that it intends to project around the world. And it is incredible to me in many ways that that we could have a discussion, a rational discussion in the halls of power in the United States or elsewhere in the Western world, questioning whether or not the United States is or is not an empire. It seems almost self-evident, and yet we have to discuss it because the mythology overrides that within the narrative. And I want to return back to a couple of comments that were just made. Number one, I would agree with most of what was said actually by both of the gentlemen there, but I would disagree with the notion that the center of power of this empire is truly in Washington. I think that what you have is a binary relationship between Washington, which is the political seat of power, and Wall Street, which is the financial seat of power. It is global capital, it is finance capital that really bankrolls and runs this imperial system. And I return to this point about systems because it is, I mentioned historical examples of empires, but only today do we see a truly globalized imperial system, one that is supranational in many ways. The seat of power is not simply in one or even only two places. It is spread out across the globe, and it is connected through a variety of networks, through a variety of channels, be they corporate, be they financial, be they military, political, what have you. And so it is this system, a comprehensive system, that we're really talking about here, not simply the United States. And finally, if I could just quickly mention, I would disagree slightly with idealizing the notion of America's past. If you look at America's genocidal past against the native people, against black Africans and others, you can see that many of these same traits that we're ascribing to an imperial America were very much true from the very beginning of this country. So I would caution against overly idealizing that past.
You know, Bruce, it's really interesting to me.
Well, if I could just interject here.
Go ahead, because I was just going to say that a great deal of American political science and international relations theory, when I read it, is a justification for empire. I just wanted to throw that in there. Go ahead, Bruce. You want to react to what Eric had to say. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think that it's correct to say that the center of the universe is Washington, D.C. When Wall Street needed the bailout of Washington, D.C., the Fed, trillions of dollars of money funneled into Wall Street and elsewhere in order to sustain their solvency. If it wasn't Washington, they would have been bankrupt. And moreover, it's the characteristic of empire that they fight purposeless, objectless wars. They're not there to make money. They're there to be bullies. They're there to dominate for the sake of domination, which is ultimately their downfall. They lose money. The Soviet Union understood that as well. They went bankrupt trying to prop up Central and Eastern European satellites. And that's what's happening in the United States. It's certainly true that Wall Street and moneyed interest, the military-industrial complex, piggybacks on this war complex to make money. But the driving force is simply to want to exercise this attitude of an adolescent. I get to tell everybody else what they ought to do and how they ought to act because I'm number one. That's captured in this phrase American exceptionalism, like we have angelic DNA and everybody else has the devilish DNA, and that's why we need to rule the world. And that will ultimately be our downfall. There have been many other people who claimed they were a master race, and when you start to believe you're a master race and you're not subject to the same fallibilities and vices as ordinary people with the same DNA, you do not have a long shelf life left.
All right, that's a good point. On that point, we're going to go to a short break, gentlemen, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Pax Americana. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing Pax Americana. Okay, I'd like to go back to our guest in London. You know, one of the characteristics of empire is its brutality and its use of force, the use of fear. But it's not usually stupidity or ignorance. And this is what I find about the American empire. When I look at some of its policies, like in the Middle East, are totally contradictory to the country's own national interest. That's not how empires are supposed to operate, but this one does. Go ahead in London.
Okay, just a few comments, what I said earlier on and what my colleague said. When I tried to outline the principles upon which the American Empire project was based, and these principles I mentioned can be identified in the National Security Council document 68, which was written in 1950, authored actually by Paul Nitze, one of the key persons in the American political establishment at the time. Of course, things change over time. The U.S. Empire project did not operate as it wanted to operate. There were serious problems. The first serious problem the empire encountered was a defeat in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. The second serious problem was the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, and when the dollar lost a lot of power. And since then is what I believe, and I disagree with one of my colleagues here, since then I believe the slow and protracted decline of American, especially economic power, started. Because once the Bretton Woods system collapsed, then the money have been unleashed and finance gain weight over industry. We see a shift of industrial power from the Western core to periphery, especially to China. We have new caucuses of power formed around the globe, like Southeast Asia, South Africa, even Brazil, I would say, Turkey. So the spread of power that my colleagues were talking about, we are not guided by Washington, D.C. These are independent caucuses of industrial power with possibility of extending into military power.
Okay,
Look at the conflict over Ukraine, for example.
Exactly. That's where I want to go here. Hang on here. Let me go to Eric here, because that's a really good point here. Because I think if you... hang on. Let me go to Eric in New York here.
Yeah.
This is very interesting because, you know, it seems to me the empire is in a rush. You know, it's in a rush. It's the events being played out in the Middle East here. This all of a sudden, ISIS is the worst nightmare since the beginning of time. The hype around it is just amazing. And then we have Ukraine, we have Hong Kong. It seems the empire is in a rush because it sees its rivals coming up. It sees its relative power declining. Officially now, depending on who you ask, China has the largest economy in the world. Psychologically, that's very important here. This is one of the things I find the irrationality of the empire, because it truly feels it's going to be threatened, and relatively soon.
I would agree with that, but I would hesitate to say that it is irrational. I would say that in many ways it's incredibly rational, and it's incredibly dangerous, the sort of logic that is being used to justify what the United States is doing. Remember that the United States has learned over the course of, as was already mentioned, Vietnam and Iraq and a number of other examples, that it is not simply about winning wars. Oftentimes it is about managing chaos. It is about creating chaos and then managing that through political institutions, diplomatic institutions, and otherwise that the United States dominates. And through that, it is able to execute and to enforce its own power without having to win these wars. And I think that we see a great example of that in Ukraine right now. The United States has been very much a central hand in all of the events that have taken place in Ukraine, at the very least since late 2013. Of course, we could go back much further than that to 2004. The United States is deeply involved in the spread of ISIS and the other extremist groups in Syria, using its proxies in the Middle East. And we could point to many examples in Africa and in Latin America as well, where the United States has done this crisis management or managed chaos. And part of that comes out of the growing weakness, the growing recognition that the United States is in decline, that the BRICS Development Bank could someday challenge the IMF's hegemony, that Russia, China, and some of the other rising powers are developing into a cohesive bloc that could challenge NATO, that could vie for global supremacy. So what we see then is that the United States is becoming in many ways more unpredictable, more dangerous, and like a wounded animal, when it's trapped in a corner, it can bite and it can be very dangerous for anyone involved.
Okay, Bruce in Washington, you want to react to that?
Well, yes, I think you're absolutely correct that empires act in self-destructive ways. That's why empires generally are subject to self-ruination. The Soviet Union was a perfect example. There wasn't any external attack. It disintegrated, and it undertook similar ridiculous wars like the war in Afghanistan in 1979, purposeless, objectless. And that was the beginning of the end of the empire. The Athenian Empire with Alcibiades went and attacked Syracuse and destroyed itself. These are not rational things, other than the sense that they're only responding to this DNA that gets a thrill out of domination for the sake of domination until it finally collapses on itself. But these things hurt the United States, but they continue anyway because of this adolescent idea. It doesn't matter. I'm getting a temporary thrill, and it'll be posterity. It'll still be the future that will find the collapse on their heads, not ours. That's what happened in the Roman Empire, and it happens repeatedly with politicians just kicking the ball down the road. But I say, these are not rational. Go back and rethink. $6 trillion we spent on Afghanistan and Iraq to get failed states that still are no safeguards against terrorism harboring there. How can that be rational by any manifestation whatsoever? And take the ISIS issue.
Okay. Let's keep the time here.
There's a rationality.
Let me go to London here. Go ahead. Vasilis, do you want to jump in? It looks like you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah. I will just say a few things. You know, I mean, I hope we all kind of agree that the U.S. empire project is in a crisis, perhaps not a terminal crisis. It's not the death of the U.S. empire, but since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, there is something else is going on, something which the U.S. Cannot really manage the world the way it used to in the 40s and 50s and even 60s. Then the other thing I wanted to add, an element here, is the ideational element of the empire. There is a famous book by William Appleman Williams, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. If you haven't read it, I recommend all my students to start reading that book if they want in international relations. This is his theory of open door policy, and the ideology of all American presidents is inspired by the fact that the whole world should become like the United States. Open markets, free democracy, liberal democracy, everywhere. And they believe in that. Obama believes in that. Bush believed in that. They really believe in that thing. I think it's absurd. This is how can I call it, a deficient and erroneous strategic culture. You cannot go to the Middle East and say, I'm going to overthrow Saddam, and I'm going to have free market and democracy and liberty and all that stuff that we know from the American Constitution. It doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. That's a really good point.
Can I jump in here real quick, Peter?
Go ahead, Eric. Go ahead.
You know,
no, let's go to Eric.
It is not
let's
Germany.
Keep it moving.
I mean,
I think we should be cognizant of the fact that we cannot think about imperial power as simply military power, the power of force. The United States has perfected the art of a number of different forms of power, coercion, using soft power, as we've seen in the so-called color revolutions over the course of the last decade, exporting academic and institutional power through the founding of universities around the world to peddle its influence in those countries. We see the use of a variety of forms of power, asymmetrical warfare, these private military contractors, a number of various and overlapping often institutions that are ways in which the United States actually exercises its power beyond simply using its straight military force. And until we can actually recognize the fact that the power that the U.S. projects is done through proxy elements and through various other forms of power, only then are we really going to recognize the totality of American imperial influence and domination. And I would again disagree with the notion that empires never act rationally. Just because the logic is flawed doesn't mean it's a completely irrational act. The United States, what it's done in Syria is to prevent its regional rivals from having an alliance and developing their power. The same is true in Afghanistan. The same is true in Iraq.
Let me jump in here. Eric, let me
Yeah.
jump in here. When I'm saying like irrational, I'll give you an example. American support of Israel in the Middle East. That is against America's interest in the region, I would say, and its image in the world overall. That's something that, it doesn't necessarily have to do, but it does. Eric.
Well,
Peter, I would
the
agree
clear
with that.
example is what the invasion of Iraq.
Bruce's comment earlier about the irrationality of empire.
Okay, Bruce, go ahead. Jump in. Last word. Go ahead.
I still insist that. What makes any sense about attacking Saddam Hussein? He had no fly zones. He was a barrier against Iran. It was a gratuitous war, cost us trillions of dollars. It's got nothing but create chaos, make Iran a stronger rather than a weaker power. I don't see how anyone could say that was a rational decision. It was idiotic. It was self-destructive. But that's what empires do.
I didn't say it was a good decision. I said that there was rationality.
No,
there is a rationality to imperialism. There is a rationality to it.
Okay, all right, gentlemen, we've run out of time. I really wish we had a lot more time here. But anyway, many thanks to my guests in Washington, New York, and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.